Hi everyone, Timothy Ferris here to talk a bit about liberalism. If you've been watching any of these talks, you know that I like to start by defining terms, and that's particularly important when it comes to liberalism, which has grown to include dozens of different meanings, some of them opposite to one another. Reminds me a bit of the term Ritz. Back around 1900, a Swedish hotelier named Ritz opened two high-class hotels, one in Paris and one in London. And during the 20th century, the term Ritz, his last name, came to be a synonym for luxury. There was a song called Putting on the Ritz, and things were said to be ritzy and so forth. And a lot of hotels got called Ritz, and that's kind of what's happened to liberalism. It's been so popular and so successful that all sorts of inferior versions of it have come to be called by that same name. What I'm going to be talking with you about today is the original, what I would call the genuine form of liberalism, what some like to call classical liberalism. It's the founding philosophy of the United States of America and of the other liberal democracies, as they are called, including the nations of Western Europe, Australia, Canada, South Korea, and so forth. In all, roughly 40% of human beings now live in liberal democracies. They say that they prefer it that way, and the majority of people polled in the rest of the world who do not live in liberal democracies say that they would prefer if they could too. So let me give you a definition of liberalism. It is government by consent of the governed, who are equal under the law, and who have a natural right to life, liberty, and property. Some leftists don't like that term property so much, but as we've discussed in other talks in this series, if you take away property rights, the other rights don't mean much. So liberalism can be summed up in the statement that people are free to do as they please, so long as they don't trespass on the equal rights of other people. Liberalism sounds like an ideology, but it isn't. It's a method of governance based on science, on the basis of science, which is experimentation, a point that still isn't widely understood even today. The liberal democracies don't always live up to their ideals. No nations do. And the democracies seem always to be in a mess, veering right to left, while authoritarian governments appear to be moving efficiently toward 5-year goals and things of that sort. And yet history has now established very, very clearly that the liberal democracies outperform the authoritarian governments. They're messy in the short term, but much more stable and much more dependable in the long term. And the liberal democracies outperform the authoritarian countries by every standard: health, wealth, and the happiness of their citizens. To me, the discovery that a free people with a minimal government outperform every other form of government is darn good news. I would call it one of the greatest discoveries in all of political history. So let's talk about the origins of liberalism. You know, when Tom Paine was writing back at the time of the American Revolution, he used to make fun of the monarchies by saying that monarchs and other authoritarian leaders are always trying to obscure their origins because, in fact, they took power through force, not through any kind of justice or popular support. And Paine said, well, those of us who support democracy, however, can be very clear about our origins, so let me do that about liberalism. And to do so, I'd like to start with a teacher. You know, if anybody who's done any teaching knows that the good you may do for your students often goes unheralded. But there are exceptions, and one is a teacher named Bill Small. Bill Small was a professor at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And he was a professor of what they called then natural philosophy, or what we today would call science. In the year 1760, a 16-year-old student showed up and enrolled at the college after riding 3 days on horseback. His name was Thomas Jefferson. And had Bill Small been another teacher, Jefferson might have been given the education suitable to a Virginia plantation owner in waiting. But Professor Small was familiar with science. He would accumulate one of the finest collections of scientific instruments to be found anywhere in the world. And he was familiar in particular with the political philosophy of John Locke. And Locke had seen, as Bill Small also came to realize, that the essence of science is not having bright ideas, even though it was called natural philosophy. Science isn't a philosophy. The essence of science is experimentation. Science arose, the kind of force in nature that we know it to be today, as soon as technology reached the point that it became possible to buy or build apparatus that would answer questions you put to it through experimentation. Questions like how the blood circulates in the body or how objects fall in a vacuum. So Locke saw that the important thing in society is not dogma or tradition, but experimentation, and that the way to permit experimentation is to maximally free the citizens in a democratic society. Bill Small taught Jefferson about the work of three men in particular, whom Jefferson always thereafter regarded as the three greatest men who ever lived. Francis Bacon, who understood what was happening with technology and tried to predict the incredible increases in wealth and well-being that technology in the future could bring about. Isaac Newton, whose Principia had shown the power of science to extend both on the earth and out into the heavens. And John Locke. Locke's philosophy became the basis of the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote less than 20 years later, and which adheres so closely to Locke's philosophy that Jefferson in later life had to defend himself against claims that he had simply copied down from Locke's works rather than coming up with language of his own. Locke also recognized that other aspects of society would have to be bolstered if liberal governance was to work. We'd need universal public education, and we needed a free news media so that everyone's voice could be heard. By the way, having a free news media caused as much trouble back then in the 18th century as it is doing today, with just hideous charges being thrown at politicians and other public figures without any regard for their factuality. If you look at Thomas Jefferson's second inaugural address as president, he refers to the United States as an experiment and says that, nobody really has ever been attacked as much in the press as I have, and yet I got reelected. So the American experiment so far, this experiment in maximal freedom, continues to work. One final point to make about classical liberalism is that it is the only political philosophy I can think of that was written to address the welfare of all people, not one specific group. Liberalism means freedom for all, or it means nothing at all. How's liberalism done in the world? Well, as I've been indicating, it's very popular in the countries that it pertains, but it's also been a force for good in the world at large. It is because of the liberal democracies that slavery is now illegal in virtually every nation. It is because of liberal democracy and its alliance with science, including the much maligned science of economics, I might add, that we now live in a time of health, wealth, and happiness beyond the dreams even of Francis Bacon, who was smart enough that some people think he wrote Shakespeare's plays, but who, like everyone, had difficulty peering very far into the innovative and inventive future. So I'd like to end by suggesting that we use the word liberalism properly to mean what I've been defining it to mean and what scholars call it to mean and what it's meant in the founding and the operation of the liberal democracies. The successive ideologies that claim to have built upon or improved liberalism and that therefore call themselves liberal are by and large less liberal than liberalism itself. If you promise people a kind of hyper-liberalism in which everyone will be forced to be exactly equal in every circumstance, and they'll all have exactly the same education, they'll all learn official dogma, they'll all have exactly the same amount of success because if they get ahead of the crowd, then the government will take their money and push them back down into an equal state. All of these kind of alleged hyper-liberal solutions, communism, socialism, and such, have failed in practice because, as we've had an opportunity now to see over a course of centuries, a free people in which people get to make the most decisions about their own lives and their communities are the most successful. I'll leave you with a quote. This is from John Stuart Mill's classic work On Liberty. He writes, "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it." Thanks for listening. See you all next time. Recommended reading on liberalism: John Stuart Mill's classic On Liberty, and Fareed Zakaria's The Future of Freedom, originally published in England as Illiberal Democracy. It's about the interplay between democracy and liberalism. As Fareed points out, the execution of Socrates by the ancient Greeks was democratic, but not liberal.